We are marching for democracy. 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 We are marching for democracy. Well, welcome to the library for our third now Democracy Forum on the first Mondays of every month now. The purpose of the library, the essence of the library, is to support democracies. So I think it's very appropriate that we try to figure out what democracy is and whether we want it. So hopefully we'll do more than just these forums. We'll really try to support a democracy center in the library and maybe get some resources and some other discussion groups about various aspects of it. My name's Howard Burrows. I'm a trustee here, so I get to start things like this. And I'm going to introduce Woody, who does all the work. You ready?
Thank you, Howard. I'm Woody Bernhardt, for those of you who don't know me. The organizer of the Democracy Forum, together with Nick Biddle, and with the help of many other people. And just like to say thanks to the library for hosting us. And as Howard said, every Monday, first Monday of the month, we're here with the Democracy Forum. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Stephen Vannoy, local psychologist, and Stephen will be presenting on wholehearted activism. Can't wait to hear it, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Woody and Howard and the staff here at the library for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've lived in Brattleboro for about 2 years, and I just live up the street, and so I walk by here usually a couple times a day at least, and often in the evening coming home from socializing with my friends. And I look across the street and I see this room full of people so often. And it really sort of warms my heart to think I live in a community where people are willing to take the time to come out and learn new things and engage in dialogue. And it's a little bit humbling to be a part of that. So I really appreciate this opportunity a lot, and I appreciate you all coming out to listen to this discussion this evening. So this talk is a part of the Democracy Forum, but I'm only marginally going to speak about democracy and politics directly. The focus of this talk is really on how we get engaged in activism or civic action, what inhibits us from getting more engaged, and what contributes to be effective in our engagement. So thinking about ways of being more effective. So, and I believe that the Democracy Forum fits into the bigger picture of our current situation in the world, which I believe is really subsumed under the climate crisis, and how our political system, our economic system, and our social system has led us into this current state of crisis. And I think a lot these days about how we're going to get out of that. Politics certainly being one of them, one of the contributing factors, and something that we have to be acutely aware of. So, and I want to start out by giving you a little background about how I wound up being in front of this podium. I think it's important for context to understand why I'm thinking about things that I am and the way I am. So I grew up in Iowa, in a small town, in a blue-collar family. My family was not politically oriented. It was not civically oriented. There were no discussions of politics. Until I was an adult, I wouldn't have even known what political party my parents might or might not have been affiliated with. And so it wasn't until I got to college, like many people, that I got exposed to really sort of more worldly ideas and getting the idea that I was a part of a an interconnected network of human beings around the world, and that my actions mattered, not only to my own life and my family, but the bigger web of human life. And so I was fortunate to wind up in Iowa City, a little liberal hub in the Midwest, and get exposed very quickly to a whole lot of ideas that were new and, luckily for me, I think, exciting. One of the first things I learned there was that men could wear earrings, so I promptly got one. But it was 1983, so I only got one. The other one would come later in the story. And it's there that I got engaged in my first civic action. And in those days, the students were demonstrating to get the university to divest their financial investments in South African corporations in protest of apartheid. So I participated in that, and I explored and learned things through classes and through social engagement that I found very interesting. Simultaneously, though, coming from a blue-collar family, being the first person in my family to go to college, I was also very anxious about how I was going to support myself in the world and what my future was in that realm. I'd grown up working on farms, and I decided that that's really not how I wanted to make my living. It instilled a very deep respect for how hard farmers work to provide us with our food, which I cherish to this day, but I didn't feel like that's what I wanted to do with my life. And so there was sort of this dichotomy between how do I earn a living and and what interests me and what sort of feeds my soul. And I didn't have models of integrating those two things. So it was 1983, the personal computer had only recently been invented, and that seemed like the horizon of the future, so I studied computers. Shortly after that, graduating, I ended up out in Seattle. Another lucky move to the West Coast, where I was exposed to yet another cultural shift, the place where people go to reinvent themselves. And there, again, I found myself drawn to socially oriented activities, but I continued. I worked at the university, I worked in a medical research lab, I was the computer guy there. That seemed like pretty good work, but it was pretty disconnected from these ideas of the environment. I was out in Seattle where I started shopping at the Puget Sound Consumers Co-op, the PCC, which is now a big conglomeration, but those days was still a pretty small network of neighborhood co-ops, riding my bike or walking to work, being conscious of trying to tread lightly on the earth. So there was this personal life and the professional life. And they were sympathetic, but they weren't fully integrated. Along that path, I discovered meditation, and quickly after that was led to Buddhist psychology and philosophy. And that was really exciting for me. I found it very helpful for my own personal life. I was still a young man at that time and had my issues with being angry and resentful, things that I didn't think were right. And Buddhist practice really, really helped me with that. And so in my 20s and early 30s, I did a deep dive into Buddhist practice, studying the philosophy and the psychology and the tools that Buddhists bring to helping us have a clear mind and inner peace. A couple more twists and turns, and I find myself in Madison, Wisconsin, because there's a very strong Buddhist community there and some very esteemed teachers. And I was volunteering in the Dane County Jail, teaching meditation to the inmates there. The jail welcomed me in as a volunteer because I promised them I could help the men with their anger. And they were very happy about that, because a lot of what people who administer jails and prisons do is respond to angry inmates. So if they thought if I could help with that, that would be great. I offered to teach a class to the women as well, and they said, no, they don't need that. So they said, could you do stress management? And I said, oh yeah, I can do stress, that's no problem. So eventually I got to offer it to the men and the women. And I found that very rewarding. And so sort of quickly, I got the notion that maybe this computer programming stuff had run its course, And so I enrolled in graduate school there in Madison to get a master's degree in counseling. And very quickly then entered into the PhD program because I like academia, I like doing research. I was very interested in whether these Buddhist principles could be extracted into a sort of a secular package and delivered in a way that one didn't have to believe in Buddhism, and would the establishment believe it. This was before mindfulness became such a well-known and ingrained thing in our modern, in the modern field of psychology. So it was still fairly radical. And that was really a sweet spot in my life because what I was doing full-time as a graduate student was what I was doing full-time in my personal life, which was really developing these tools, becoming more and more skilled at these tools, and understanding how the prison industrial complex came to be and how this oppression from our political and economic system was working out to marginalize individuals, and the cost that we were paying as a society for the benefits that a few were reaping in their profits. Also during that time, of course, 9/11 happened. So Madison is a fantastic place to be an activist. If you're not familiar with it, the University of Wisconsin campus at one end of State Street, the sort of economic hub of shopping and commerce, and at the other end is the state capital of Wisconsin. And so it's just a great place to have demonstrations because there's this energy between the university and the capital and commerce. So, of course, the 9/11, the post-9/11 protests and demonstrations against the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq were a very common occurrence. Ultimately, though, it became time to graduate. And again, I was faced with job seeking. But now I felt like I could do something that was a little bit closer to my heart. I wound up out at the University of Washington. I went back to Seattle and worked there at the university in the medical school, this time in the psychiatry department, and spent my time there, and interestingly or ironically, shifting away from the meditation practices and the things that I had developed and looking at mental health from a public health perspective. So the group that I was enmeshed in was particularly focused on how do we deliver better mental health services where people in the United States seek them, which is primary care. It's not mental health specialty, it's primary care. The majority of mental health treatment in this country gets delivered there, and those systems are not set up to do that. So this sort of appealed to my mind, the sense of how to do a little bit of good for the most people. And so I spent a number of years there working on that and thinking about this whole situation of where people get their mental health treatment, how it serves them or doesn't serve them, and how hard it is to get that system to change, even though we had very good tools coming out of even traditional psychology research that just should have been adopted from the get-go, and we would fight tooth and nail to get those methods integrated day in and day out. And it was sort of two steps forward, one step forward, two steps back. So I had a sort of a split. I recognized that my work was taking me too far away from these values and interests in social engagement. I continued in my private life to do that. So again, another sort of decision-making point and a move out to UMass Boston, where there was a brand new counseling psychology PhD program that was created. And I felt like at this point in my life, I had some tools and some skills that not only did I want to deliver myself, but I wanted to pass on and to train mental health professionals to do that. So it's my current position is at UMass Boston teaching in the counseling psych program. But I moved up here. I knew I was tired of living in the city. I knew I wanted to get back out into nature. So I moved up here to Vermont, to a dirt road outside of Chester, in the middle of the woods, where I was surrounded by nature every day. And I could really spend time being influenced just by the fact of being in nature. And making friends down here in Brattleboro and being influenced by people involved in the Democracy Forum, being educated in aspects of history and politics that I wasn't very keenly aware of. And during these past few years, and particularly in the last year, as I've been on a sabbatical, I've really been thinking a lot about what motivates people to become engaged in civic action, what motivates or what causes people to become burnout or to avoid it, and how can we get more people involved? Because the problems that we face right now are created by very complex human interactions, social interactions, global interactions across multiple cultures, political systems, economic systems, societies. And I believe that the only way we're going to get out of this mess is through complex social interactions. I don't think clubbing people over the head is likely to lead us to where we need to get. And so what is it about that that is difficult? And that's why I'm here now to present some of these ideas and things that I've learned about for myself and that I want to share and find out what you think about them. So I believe that many of us get motivated and activated to become engaged in political civic life through anger. Right? We recognize injustice happening, and it makes us angry. We think about the future that's being robbed from us and from our children and future generations. It makes you angry. Just last Tuesday night, I was upstairs attending the screening of a documentary called Rollbacks. It was put on by the Climate Cafe. It was 40 minutes of presentation of the policies that were in place from the previous administration in the White House to somewhat possibly curb the climate crisis. Nobody thinking that it's actually enough, but they were there. And when you see, when you watch for 40 minutes, the documentary showing one after another policy being removed, undermined, taken away, and the betrayal that I felt and that was palpable in the room. After 40 minutes, we circled up, and there was an angry group of people up there. You know, there's no other way to react when you see that initially than to be angry. And a lot of people, this is what gets us motivated. And anger is supremely well-tuned in our psyche, in our bodies, in our physiology, to get us activated. That's what it does. So good for it. The question is that the only thing that we have available to us? And are there limitations of anger that actually undermine our goals? And could we tap into other resources that would keep us engaged? So I want to talk a little bit about why anger is maybe not where you want to put all your eggs if you're interested in activism. So first of all, anger is expensive to us physically. Right? When we get angry, we produce a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, various stress hormones, which is appropriate to get you activated and moving, but it's also draining. Right? It's expensive. We become exhausted. We can only maintain that anger for so long. Some of us much longer than others, some of us not for very long at all, but it takes a toll on us physically. So we can't maintain it. Right? And it's not healthy also over the long run. But anger also affects us psychologically. It does a few things. One is it gives us a sense of urgency. We want to fix the problem right now. Our time horizon gets shortened into the immediate. And we are focused on a solution in the moment, the quickest, fastest solution that will alleviate our sense of threat or fear. Right? Anger focuses our attention also on the perceived threat, and only on the aspects of the perceived threat that are threatening. So the object of our anger becomes just a threat. Okay. Anything else in our environment is assumed to be threatening if we're aware of it, because we automatically go into a biased perception where we perceive things to be threatening. it's safer from an evolutionary perspective to assume something is a threat and possibly be wrong than to assume that something is not and make that mistake, right? So it fits and it works. But these two aspects, I mean, the shortening of the urgency, the shortening of the horizon, the focusing in on the object and the sort of one-dimensional view of what that object represents, and then the bias to see everything else around that may come into our perception as threatening, drastically undermines our ability to achieve a solution to this threat that is actually fundamentally a complex social problem, not a physical threat. Right? This anger is sticking around. It's an evolutionary product, and it was very useful when our primary threats for our species were physical threats. But now they're primarily social threats, and anger is not well suited to solving them. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have its place, but I'm just saying it has some limitations. And we have other things, fortunately, that are suitable. Before I talk about those, I also want to add in a sort of perspective that one of the things that anger also does is it covers up other emotions that we may be having when we perceive something that we care about as being threatened or harmed that can be valuable to us. Things like sadness, grief, pain, and fear, right? These emotions are also likely to be appropriate emotions when we think about the loss of the future of an environment that can sustain human life. Grief seems reasonable, sadness, fear. But we can quickly shift to anger when we don't want to feel those painful feelings. We don't like them. They're not comfortable feelings, those are. And anger often comes in because we can get motivated. We can, instead of being drained, pulled down by those emotions, we can get energized, and we can blame somebody else for those feelings. We don't have to accept those feelings as a reflection of how things are. We can just focus our blame on someone else. And the real problem, there's two problems here. One is that those emotions, if we don't attend to them, they don't go away. They just sort of fester there, right? But we go through these cycles of getting stimulated, getting angry, getting exhausted, going through recovery, maybe avoidance and denial, getting triggered again, getting angry, and we're not attending to those emotions, and that costs us psychologically as well. The other thing that it does, those emotions of sadness, pain, fear, those emotions actually are emotions that will draw social support to us. Right? When somebody's angry, it doesn't really draw others to them. We don't draw people in. People don't get sympathetic. When I start expressing my anger, people don't come over and put their arm around me. "Oh, Stephen, it's all right. You know, it's okay. I'm sorry you're feeling that way." That's not the, people just kind of disappear at best, or put off their cuffs and we go at it. But if I express sadness or grief, I'm much more likely to get people to be interested in what's going on and willing to talk and support me. So those emotions are emotions of vulnerability. Right? Vulnerability is an opening to collaboration and cooperation. It really, really gets me angry when I think about the fact that a politician in this country cannot express regret or acknowledge a mistake, because that is perceived as a vulnerability that is unacceptable. How many people here think you can live your life without admitting making a mistake? You're going to be a very lonely person, because nobody likes to be around someone who can't admit a mistake. How can you be forgiven? How can you have a complex social relationship without being able to do that? So in our activist life, if we aren't able to show our vulnerability, it's difficult to form the kind of complex social relationships that we need to sustain us for the long haul. Right? All right, so the limitations of anger. It's physically exhausting. It shapes our thinking. It biases our thinking. And I use that not in a negative term necessarily, but it shapes our thinking to be immediately focused and to perceive things as threat and to be very difficult to be very slow to change our perception and evaluation of threat. Very slow, right? It's hard to say, oh, maybe I'm not right. Maybe I've misperceived as something. So, it turns out that there's a whole host of other emotions and relational tools that we have that actually are almost diametrically opposed to the effect that anger has. And I want to talk about a few of those. The first I want to talk about is compassion. Okay? Compassion I want to talk about, partly it's close to my heart. It is a fundamental principle in Buddhism. Dalai Lama is often quoted as saying, compassion is my religion. It's fundamental. It's an essential must-have emotion, belief, mindset. And obviously, compassion is a pro-social sort of emotion. The definition that I'm using for that term is the wish for someone else or some being to be free of suffering. Simple definition. Compassion is the wish for someone or something to be free of suffering, which then motivates us, if we can, to alleviate that suffering, if we're capable of doing it. And that seems like maybe a stretch about how does that fit into my social engagement? How does it fit into being an activist, changing the course of history that we're on? Well, it turns out that there's another effect of compassion that isn't obvious, and I only am aware of it actually through modern Western psychological research. But it turns out that the compassionate mindset motivates us to be willing to postpone short-term gratification, to undergo suffering, discomfort, if you will, if suffering is too strong of a term, in the present moment in order to gain long-term benefit. Okay? Well, this is very interesting. It doesn't have to be my own long-term benefit. It doesn't have to be the long-term benefit of people that I love. This research shows that compassion extends our time horizon. It opens up our mind to thinking about possibilities, to look for opportunities, and to look for allies, resources in our environment to help us. And it gets us to invest in the future. So this research, sort of nerdy psychology research, if you took Psych 101 in college, you would have come across this kind of thing. But fundamental sort of human tendency is to discount the future. So people do a lot of research where they say, I'll give you $10 now, or I'll give you $15 in 2 weeks if you come back. And it turns out most people will take the $10 now, even though $15 in 2 weeks is almost definitely going to be more beneficial. Certainly if you're a college student, it's almost certainly you have the means to wait 2 weeks to get a 50% return on your wait. If you induce compassion, very simply, by exposing these college students to suffering, show them one of the commercials that I grew up with in the 70s of starving children, and all of a sudden they'll opt for the $15 in 2 weeks. All of a sudden, if you give them a task to sit and grade very poorly written essays, they'll do it significantly longer than their peers who weren't induced to feel compassion. So it's a surprising finding, because compassion doesn't seem, the wish for somebody to be free of suffering doesn't seem like that's a clear pathway to this idea of being more invested in future me. But it is. And if you think about it long enough, you can see the social benefit that that this emotion was evolved to help us through social interactions and to think of ourselves and our offspring in the survival of them in the long run, not just in the short run. We've got anger for the short-term physical threat. How do we, as a species, what is within us to get us to think about the long run? So kind of surprising, and it was for me really exciting to learn something about compassion that I hadn't come across yet after 25 plus years of spending an awful lot of time thinking about how to create it and what its benefits are. So compassion is one, right? And compassion is something that I like. I like to feel compassionate. I like to be around people who are expressing compassion. It energizes me. I feel like I want to get up and do something when I'm feeling compassion. I feel willing to get up and do something to help somebody else when I'm feeling compassion. I don't feel burned out, withdrawn. So even you don't even have to, and this is great, you don't even have to figure out how to apply compassion to the climate crisis. All you have to do is just feel some compassion, and you will act in the best interests of future you and future us, future me, future everyone. You're just more likely to take that path. So that's one. The second one, also interesting, gratitude. Okay. Now gratitude's interesting. From my background, I find it interesting that the Buddhists don't really talk about gratitude very much. Gratitude is not really, it's actually not even named. The only place that I can think of it coming up like really clearly is that one of the tools that they will use to get you to have feelings of being willing to benefit others is to think about the kindness of your mother. This is the classic metaphor, to think about the kindness of your mother. If you can't think of anything else to generate kindness in your heart, think about the kindness of your mother. Now this is interesting. I see people laughing, right? I'm a psychologist. You know how much time I spend talking to people about their relationship with their mother? I know. And I have a mother as well. And she knows. Okay? So it's really interesting to watch these Tibetan teachers come over and go to their go-to, and the whole crowd, they just see them. You know, they just like, no, what are you talking about? That's not how it works. It also actually turns out that it's really fundamental, and if you spend time figuring out how to recognize the kindness of your mother for having given you the opportunity to come into this human world and have this human experience, it can create a deep transformation in your heart and give you access to gratitude like you never had before. And very similarly to compassion, gratitude, a state of gratitude switches us into a mode of not discounting the future and being willing to postpone short-term gratification, to undergo some sort of sacrifice or hardship now in order to have benefit not only for me but for others in the future. It's a remarkable sort of finding in my mind, and the pattern for me seems to be that there are these sort of this class of pro-social emotions that all motivate us as a species to think about the future and to value the future over the short-term benefit. So compassion and gratitude, right? And gratitude, I mean, who doesn't want to feel gratitude? The absence of gratitude is such a painful place to be. The third one I want to talk about is pride. And pride's interesting as well, right? One of the 7 deadly sins, somebody said. But of course, that pride is really arrogance. That pride that kind of pride is problematic. The arrogance, the sense that I'm more important, I'm more valuable than you are, because of my what? Gender, my intelligence, the color of my skin, whatever. The kind of pride that I'm referring to really I think of sort of as more of a self-worth, right? So it turns out that if we are in a state of mind where we can acknowledge and recognize that we have something to give that is valuable to the people in our world, and maybe that we have also that comes with that the opportunity to care for ourselves and the people we love, guess what? We will postpone short-term gratification for long-term benefit. That will also induce the same behaviors. And that really sort of leads me into the second half of what I wanted to talk about, this notion of recognizing what we have to offer and what might be keeping people from engaging in the causes that are important to them and important to all of us. And I think it has a lot to do with this sense of identity, who we think we are, what we think we have to offer to the world, and how that might or might not make a difference. So, as I mentioned, I came from a background where I didn't think or see myself in a place of leadership for these kinds of problems. I didn't think that I had something to give that would benefit that. And as I grew and developed knowledge and skills and maturity, my focus was on tools of inner peace and inner work, and less on affecting social change. But what I recognize now is that those are the tools that are part of what are needed in order for us to overcome these complex social problems that we're faced with, is that we need to be able to access more of ourselves than just anger, right? We need to be able to access these parts of ourselves that give us the endurance, that give us the motivation, that give us the mental state of being creative and expansive in our thinking. Because the only way we're going to solve these problems is through collaborating, cooperating, as I mentioned before, with people from around the world who speak different languages, who have different values, who have different cultural traditions, who have different resources. We have to tap into and see that we have something to offer to that problem. One of the reasons I think that we don't see ourselves in that place, as I mentioned, one, if you grew up like I did in a cultural milieu where you didn't see yourself there because you didn't see people that you identified with in those roles, that's a barrier. Already you don't. We know very well the impact of minority people growing up in the United States being educated with textbooks that only represent people who look like them, in the broadest sense of the word, as failures or problems to be solved. And who do they see as being the solutions? Right? White men, a couple white women, mostly white men. And we know that that impacts their future. It impacts their sense of identity and what they can accomplish. And it works also on many of us. If you didn't see yourself represented in those communities, how do you get to the place of seeing yourself there? Some people, fortunately, overcome that through circumstances. The other thing that impedes our engagement is the mentality that's really deeply ingrained in American society. It's often called the great man theory. And is that individuals, great individuals, usually white men, but great individuals are the ones who solve our problems. And since I am not a great individual, although I am a white man, I'm not a great individual in my mind, what can I do? What can I do? Okay. It doesn't help when you're, you can just see it so clearly. I see Greta addressing thousands of people, this young woman, and that can only sometimes just reinforces my view of like, I'm not her, humbling as that is, I'm not. But that is really a trap that can keep us from thinking that we have the ability to affect change. Real change. Right? Not just, the things that we must do to tread lightly, but to actually take a leading role, a role of leadership and support in these communities. So the way, I think the way for us to cultivate that, if that isn't your identity already, is that we really have to do some deep soul searching to find out what it is that we have, and we have to have that pride. We have to recognize that we have gifts to offer that are valuable, that are unique to each and every one of us. I know many of you in the audience, and I know you each as individuals with gifts that are unique to you. Every one of us has these gifts. We all have our story. You all have the story that I was able to share mine this evening, but you all have a story that shaped who you are at this point in time in your life and what you have to offer. And part of the reason I shared that story is I want to sort of make it clear and acknowledge that we are all works in progress, all of us. And what gifts we have change over time. And there are different things to be working at different times in our lives. And we don't need to feel bad about that. We can own that. We can see that time that I spent, I needed to develop the tools to cultivate inner peace within myself in order to be able to be a constructive member of my society, really. I really needed that. I was pretty out of control. So without spending the time to cultivate that, I wouldn't be here doing this. So it's a developmental process, and we have to continuously keep checking in with ourselves to identify what it is at this point in my life that I have to offer. And to recognize when it changes. Right? Because it's not always marching in the streets. It's not always direct action. Right? Fortunately, there are youth for whom that is exactly really what they are good at doing. They have the energy, right? They have the passion. That time of life is really, that's what that is for. We can continue doing it, but there may be other ways that we can contribute. Right? There are other ways, all the way through life. I was just reading an interview with Joanna Macy. Some of you may be aware of her work in environmental activism from the 60s, really. And her sort of beginning to struggle with the transition that she was going through at about age 70, of no longer being able to travel around the world and be the doer. Be the person who organized and got 1,000 people to show up at an event and motivated. She's shifting into a time where she's a beer. She's focusing on her being, how she is in her community now, shaping as she becomes an elder. Unfortunately, in our society, we don't value this role of people very well. People don't value it in themselves. They can see it as a time of failure, that their time is over. But I want to say that it's clearly not. The wisdom and experience that people gain over their lifetimes and their ability to bring that shifts in a different way, but it's powerful. And it's actually, I believe, essential to the whole ecology of us as a species to collaborate and cooperate with each other. So, started out just describing some of the emotions and psychological states that we can use to effectively address these complex social interactions. And right there are some clues for you all around the gifts that you have to offer, because some of us are more easily able to tap into things like compassion or gratitude than others. That might be a place where you have something really powerful to offer. And then the notion of our identity and how our identity gets in the way of us feeling like we have power and are able to be effective. And the tools, there are tools also available for that kind of self-reflection and exploration and cultivation of those tools. And that's time well spent, because until we tap into those, we will doubt ourselves. We will convince ourselves that we aren't important, that we aren't powerful, that we're doing enough. Not to beat up on ourselves. Anything you do, thank you. And I'm glad that you did it. But what can I do next? What can I do to keep going? Because this is a long game that we're all involved in, right? The horizon is getting shorter and shorter. We don't have much more time to contemplate thinking that maybe a solution will come from outside of us. But what we're investing in is the long run. So I thank you for your time and attention, and would welcome any questions they might have.
Me? Good. I really appreciate your talk, and especially I grew up with an angry father with a short temper, so I've tiptoed around anger my whole life. I've had an enormous amount of compassion, so much that it's almost crippling, I think, than advancing. And I've recently come upon gratitude and found how uplifting that can be. The emotion you haven't talked about is fear. And that's what I observe in terms of this social equation that we're currently in, being manipulated almost more than any other emotion. And how does one take an activist role to deal with the fear that's being perpetrated and disabling people from action or pushing them in the kind of action that isn't productive?
Yeah. Fear is, it is a big one. It deserves a whole being addressed for a considerable amount of time. I think, and I believe from my own experience, that there are a number of ways of thinking through situations. But I mean, first of all, fear is completely appropriate, all right? I mean, the climate crisis should induce some fear. It is an appropriate response. Sometimes we're being manipulated to be afraid of things that we aren't, right? The question of the conversations in my life in the last week have been about coronavirus and how afraid should I be? And I vacillate back and forth between thinking that I'm being manipulated or I'm being betrayed or I should probably wash my hands or what, right? So it's very difficult in a world where it's hard to get accurate information or information that you trust. That only continues to undermine the fear. So, I mean, I think to answer your question is complicated and multifaceted. But I do believe that compassion is a great tool of working with fear by allowing us to see that we're not alone. It does that thing when we're compassionate and express compassion and recognize that we're not suffering alone, that people, that does something to us as human beings. Upstairs, watching that film, after the anger dissipated, then we did a couple rounds of sadness and grief. And then we did a round of fear. What are we going to do about this? This is terrifying. And then we did a round of, it just sort of naturally turned to a sense of feeling supported people started expressing care. There was a little bit of problem solving that might not have been so helpful because it can feel hollow if it comes too quickly. But that sense that here was a group of people who cared, I'm not alone, that goes a long way to helping get centered around fear. And then that sense of pride, I mentioned sort of having resources to give, but also embedded in there is sort of courage and a sense of grounding that you can use to respond to fear so that it's not paralyzing. I would say that what you don't want to do really is focus on chasing the fear away, because there's easy ways to do that, right? There's easy ways to distract us or to dull our senses to make the fear go away. We want to hold on to that fear a little bit, keep it real, acknowledge it, but not be paralyzed by it. Yeah, Tim.
First of all, thank you for the cogent and compelling presentation. I found it fascinating. One indication for me is that I had about a zillion thoughts pop in my head as you're going along.
Great.
In 1892, I think it was, William James wrote a very powerful essay called The Moral Equivalent to War. And what he meant there, and I'm sure some people here are familiar with that, was that he looked at the passion and the earnestness and the commitment that people had going to war. And he said, how can we take those elements, those attributes, and for more, quote, constructive means other than war?
Yeah.
And so I was just curious if you could respond at all to that in any way. I don't know if that's give you enough direction. I'm not sure. But.
No, that's a very interesting situation. William James, people don't know, is sort of considered the founder of psychology in America. He's written many things related to human behavior. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, that this is a product of an educational system and a cultural value around what it means to be of service to your country that's instilled in us very, very early on at the expense of other ways of being of service to your country. So I thought about going into the military when I was young. My father had been an enlisted soldier. I didn't think about Teach for America, Peace Corps, or other things that are presented at least as being socially constructive. So I didn't have models for that. So I think that starts early, and it deeply affects our sense of, historically, of what it means to be a man, and how do you demonstrate manhood, and how do you demonstrate being an honorable man, is that you're willing to go sacrifice yourself for your country. And then that narrative just gets played out, right? What happened after, to support our troops, bumper stickers that were so prevalent a decade ago, mostly. And the notion that the American psyche sort of says, okay, we've created this sacredness around masculinity, and now we're all going to join together to reinforce it. Because if we undermined that, where would we be? Yes.
As a fellow Buddhist, I really appreciate the way you incorporated your Buddhism into your politics. I think it was eye-opening, and thank you. I'm also a Platonist, and one of the things that, well, just first of all, it's a little history for me. I've been working hard labor for the past 45 years. I got 2 new shoulders this winter, so I haven't been doing hard labor, and I've had time to think. And I have a degree in philosophy which majored in Plato and the Socratic Method. And what I'm seeing and what I'm trying to find an outlet for is ways in which I, or we, people want to join, can use the Socratic method to talk to the opposition, whoever they may be. I mean, the Socratic method is very, very specific. It's not just dialogue. It's a very spiritual way of communicating to others and seeing what they know, and also teasing out arguments that aren't the best, and thus pursuing the truth. And the virtue that comes to mind for me in this, that along with compassion, is curiosity, and being able to really talk to the opposition. I mean, I listen to arguments from the Trump side, the opposition, or even my own side, and I think these are terrible arguments. These aren't just because they encourage bad things. They're just plain illogical. They're just plain, they're not based on fact. They would make Socrates' head blow up. I mean, it's painful to listen to them. And I want to find some kind of an outlet to engage with other people who don't see the world the way I do, and I can see what they know, and they can have an opportunity to ferret out the truth and create change that way. That seems like fertile ground to me. I haven't been able to quite figure out a means for that, aside from the occasional letter to the paper that criticizing someone else's letter. And that doesn't really work that way.
Right.
That's not a syllogism you got there. It's syllogisms don't work backwards. I mean, all that stuff. But it seems like political change. I mean, we got to start engaging, not on the internet, with human beings we disagree with in a way that's kind, but very particular about getting at the truth. I mean, not letting things go. I mean, I talk to a lot of friends who know people that they politically disagree with, and they won't do it. They just, it's too much trouble. It's they'll get mad, or it never works. And learn the Socratic method. It works. You can really engage people this way without it turning into something bad. It turns into something really good, and it makes change. It's I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you.
Well, thank you, and I thank you for offering that. And I want to reinforce what you said. Curiosity is critically important. It's challenging because curiosity turns out to be a personality trait. Some of us are more curious than others. We just are. I'm really grateful that I'm curious about the world. It's led me to explore and discover things, and it gives me a sense of wonder and awe on a regular basis that I just love. But not everybody is curious, and whatever they bring into the world is probably equally rewarding for them as well. But curiosity is very helpful because it does kind of set the stage for opening things up. And as far as the Socratic questioning goes, I mentioned I was teaching anger management in the jail, right? And I was going in there with these ideas about compassion and loving kindness. And I didn't know a few people had been in jail, but I was a little worried going into this jail setting without a lot of firsthand experience. What are these guys, less the jail, more the prison? You know the difference, jails are short-term stays, typically. Different in Vermont. But in Madison, where I was, and in most places in the country, jails are reserved for sentences that are less than 2 years. Felonies greater than 2 years, you go to a prison. So the prison is a place where people have been convicted of more serious crimes. So the first time I went into a prison to do this, I was particularly worried. How are these guys going to respond when I started asking them to think about love? I was a little nervous. And I approached the groups that I would run were a variation of Socratic questioning. So I would simply start out by saying, hey, guys, what do you think about love? And I was amazed at the richness of what came out of that question. It might have been something about, I can't get enough of it. I've never had it. It's the only thing worthwhile. It's painful. It's scary. But they engaged with it instantly. Probably because I didn't tell them what love was. I asked them what love was, what it meant to them. And this group, and I've done it a couple hundred times at least. And it's never failed to produce an amazing conversation. And then they learn from one another as they share, and they respect each other's place and where they are. So I think this kind of dialogue is actually really necessary. We need new ways of conversing and exchanging. The polarity in the current system is paralyzing us. And we cannot afford to be paralyzed anymore. We have to have these conversations. We have to figure out a way to have these conversations. Absolutely. So, any other, yes?
Well, I'll start by saying I don't know anything about anything, but I have to be for something. And when I look back over education and life, I think I was always seeking role models and mentors. At this point in my life, I really don't have any mentors, and I understand why. But or my mentors have passed away. They're, in books. But I think when I'm really for something, that's when I get engaged. And the rest of the time, it's just so easy, particularly in a very liberal environment with people who share my values, to just coast and just be focused on my own learning. And what begins to change is when I'm for something, very positively for something. And it can be being for or against, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like I was for banning texting, and I worked really hard on that. And it took a few years, but we got the law. And I was for gun control, and which means being against wanting restrictions on things. I wish that I could be for control of social media, because I think it's one of the most paralyzing, destructive things out there. And it's very, very difficult to figure out how that's going to change, to see how that's going to change. I wish I could be for prohibiting meat, because that would make a huge difference. But there are things that you realize that's not worth, or it's not going to happen right now. But look for something that you can be really indeed and in word you can support. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for your humility, which is clearly humility, because you just
That's just Socratic.
shared with us causes that you worked on to help achieve, to make our society a safer place. I believe you meant texting while driving. I'm assuming that's what you meant, right? So you clearly know things and have the opportunity to give. That humility is a gift, for sure. And I saw you light up as you described those things that you were for. So that energy is a gift. And I just want to say that approximately 4 years ago, I was adamant that Donald J. Trump couldn't possibly get elected to be the president. And he did. So anytime I hear couldn't possibly happen, I will never forget that one, that prediction. I've made a lot of predictions that didn't happen, right? I mean, a lot of them. But that one, I'd have sold the farm on that one, and it wasn't happen. So I just want to offer you the opportunity to question your certainty that you couldn't affect that change.
Well, then when you fail, you learn something from that. Like,
There you go.
yeah.
Right, if you're vulnerable and can admit that. Did you, sorry, I thought your hand might have gone
Well,
up.
I wanted to share sort of along the same lines. I'm an artist and I like to travel and I'm a creative person, but early on I enjoyed the art of engaging people. The more different they were, the better, and always trying to find common ground. And I converse easily with people. I love people, and not to sound biased, but like what you just pointed out, you did not see the Trump thing happening. And I remember back when a lot of people I knew did not see Bush getting reelected. And it was
I predicted that too.
well, I don't want to get myself in trouble, but it was often these people I know who are from fairly privileged backgrounds, educated, from institutions of education, but they tend to be closed systems. They tend to interact more with each other than the outside world. They lack versatility. And I have a few friends, and when Trump got elected, we looked at each other and said, "I'm not surprised, are you?" And she said, "I'm not." Because a lot of people that you say, that, and they were often, I don't want to say neoliberal or label people, but this is an opportunity for all of us to break our patterns and to challenge our own thinking and reach out and cultivate the art of interacting with those that are very different than us and could possibly be incredibly pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we have to open to the possibility of being pleasantly surprised, or at least surprised, and to offer people the opportunity to engage with us, because we absolutely have to. I want to also sort of say, I mean, obviously I don't have answers to these difficult questions myself, but I do want to just note that I believe the biggest significant social changes that have happened, to say the last decade, have had nothing to do with political leadership. The Me Too movement, LGBTQ rights, right? Occupy Wall Street, right? These movements are not movements that were created by leadership. Leadership was somewhat coerced to follow on this, in certain areas better than other areas. So, I mean, it's political activism at the civil level that really leads to change. This is where the change will happen, all those changes. And there are people in this room who participated in other movements that were also created, not through leadership, but through civic engagement. So, any other comments? Nick, sorry.
Thanks very much for this. I'm fascinated by the way you conflate the superego, delayed gratification, into compassion and gratitude as the formula for carrying on wholeheartedly, I think is the way you might put it. And as I reflect on that and on the climate crisis, recognizing the short window within which we have for, as you put it, saving the future generations, no amount of delayed gratification is going to get me through. And so I think in terms of Buddhist practice, another component that might be folded in is detachment, and or the recognition of the vanity of it all, including my own and everybody else's fallacy and limitations, or even to use the Hindu Maya, the illusions of existing, so that we can keep a kind of Bill McKibben lightheartedness, you know, a sense of humor and a recognition, like the Dalai Lama, that this is all, it's a dream, you know, life is but a dream.
So I think that when you go into the spiritual realm, there are all kinds of ways of thinking about it differently. And those are helpful in a lot of ways. They help me in a lot of ways. They also created some tension between survival and the material world. And they can be a way. There's a whole critique within the Buddhist world about sort of this so-called engaged Buddhism, and the Buddhists who are trying to get out of the cycle of cyclic existence, because that is sort of the basic fundamental idea in Buddhism, is to get out of the cycle of existence. So don't come back in another life. And if that's what you're invested in, then you start to question how much time and energy do I want to invest in this physical life when my big job is to get out of here. And that's a tension that has to be dealt with. I do think that it can bring, it is a tool that can be used to bring some level-headedness to the dialogue and the discourse. For myself, I can ground myself with those kinds of thoughts, but then engage. What I'm doing now is engaging in the contemporary concern for humanity. I also want to say that that time horizon, the delayed gratification, doesn't have to be so far out. I mean, if we would just be thinking about the end of this year, and if we set our sights on what can we accomplish by the end of 2020, that horizon, it might be close enough to make a difference, but long enough that we're thinking about future us more than we are about future me. And those, so, yeah, that's my thought about that. Thanks. All right, oh, yeah. Sure.
Well, there's been a discussion on NPR over 4 or 5 days about the nature of truth. And so what do you do if someone that you disagree with, you know, they're not looking for the truth?
Yeah, or your truth. They're looking for their truth. They may be saying something that's not true, but they've got something there. I mean, I think that's a huge challenge. We have to find those places. When we get into arguments about things, we start to deviate from what we feel is true. We think we're talking about what is true, but we deviate from what is true to our hearts, right? We get into our heads and we start arguing about facts and figures and things, and we lose sight of that compassion, that gratitude, those things that come from our hearts that connect us as human beings. So I think it's a real trap that we can get into of focusing on truth, certainly in the material world, the truth about the coronavirus, the truth about 9/11. We can argue all day about these things and try to convince each other about who's right and who's wrong, but that doesn't get us very far. But if we think about how we want to build a future in the aftermath of 9/11 that makes the world a better place to live in for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our communities, then we might get somewhere. But we really have to connect as human beings through compassion, for one, and other ways of respect and dignity, honoring the value of each other as human beings, to get past those really hard topics. That's my thoughts. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I just want to say, I have a mailing list here. If you'd like to, I blog regularly on this topic, and I'm planning on trying to get some more activities and discussions going here in town. So if you'd like to be notified about that, please put your name and email on there. I don't sell anything to you. So there's that. And then there's also a sign-up list for the Democracy Forum to stay in touch and be informed about that. And I want to thank Woody again for inviting me here, and for his comrades to also support and encourage me to come and give this talk today, and to the library for supporting democracy and the open exchange of knowledge and discourse.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a few things. This library is meant to be our community living room, and we really want to get everybody to feel comfortable here, and I would love to see all sides of every argument. I'd like to talk about capitalism. I'd like to talk about the relationship of various forms of democracy and how we might evolve and change as we go ahead. And I think libraries, there are 186 libraries in this state. And I'm involved with the Vermont Library Association and the New England Library Association. I really think we can use a library as a discussion place for this kind of topic. And I'd love to see smaller discussions. I'd love to see other programs that are maybe not lecture form, but workshops. So keep us in mind. There are a couple of other things coming up. We have the Constitution. Usually we give out constitutions here. I'll try to get those back. I think we ran out. There are other things that we do in the library with children and with different parts of the town that all have a role to play in this democracy. And if you want to help us with that, talk us.
Thank you.